Perfect. So introduce yourself. Let's go.
All right, so hi everyone. I'm Ken. I'm in charge of growth at Svix, and I'm with Tom, our founder and CEO. Tom, how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so we got some pretty good feedback, I think, on the last video we did about webhook architecture. So we thought we'd do one on webhook best practices. And we're going to take the point of view today a little bit more on the receiver side, so best practices for receiving webhooks and consuming them, since we focused so much on the sending last time. And so just one thing we wanted to point out at the beginning is, like, if you guys have any suggestions or just comments about what you'd like to see us do in the future, please leave some comments on the video, and we'll try to put something together for that.
Cool. Yeah, I'm excited to get started. So do you want to maybe, how should we go ahead?
Yeah, so I was thinking, like, because we normally take the sending point of view, like what are the different things that you need to be thinking about between if you're the person dispatching the webhooks versus the one kind of receiving them.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, okay, putting the receiver side on, like one thing that you have to keep in mind is that the sender needs to be reliable, right? I mean, like if you're relying on getting those messages from the provider that you use, you need to make sure that this sender actually, sends them and resends them, and attempts to send them until you actually get them, or lets you know once they've exhausted all of the attempts. I know this is like from the sender side essentially, but actually as a consumer, you need to know that a sender at least gives you that level of support in order to be consuming reliably. And again, like I'm gonna start maybe. I'm going to continue with a few points that are kind of like sound sender-like, but it's kind of the things that you need to, ensure that you get as a consumer. So another one is
like what the receiver should be looking for from their providers, essentially.
Exactly, yeah. In order to be even like start consuming webhooks reliably. And another thing would be signatures. We talked about it, I think, at length in the previous video, but essentially all of the requests need to be signed so you can ensure that they were sent from the right person you're looking for. And then they're like, they're like a lot of goodies on top. So in case like either of those doesn't work well, like how can you introspect that? But I think as long as a consumer, as long as it's like being sent and being like signed correctly, I think you should be good to get going. And then like now, so, now we need to talk about what you need to do as a consumer. So actually, I'll give an example of something that we saw from a customer, one of our customers' customer the other week. So when you receive a webhook, the webhook, you need to indicate whether the receipt was a success or a failure. So usually you do that by an HTTP status code. So if you return 200, that indicates to the webhook provider that you have processed it successfully. And if you return 500 or 400 or whatever, that indicates that the webhook sender needs to retry. And what we saw from that customer's customer the other day is they were returning at 200, but the body indicated an error. So they thought that it would get retried, but actually, like all we saw is like a 200 status code, so we never retried. And so one thing is So one thing as a consumer that you need to do is kind of like understand the contract that you have between the sending provider and yourself, and make sure that you follow that. So success is a 2xx, so 200 to 299 response, and a failure is anything else. And as long as you follow that, I think you're like at a good path, like at least having a healthy relationship with the sender. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing is that you need to verify, so it's great that, the sender is sending, but you need to actually make sure, verify that it matches the signature that you expect, or more correctly, that the signature is valid. And the reason for that is that you don't want anyone to impersonate the sender. You want to make sure that you get the correct message from the correct person, etc. Another thing is like to check the timestamp of the message to make sure that no one is like replaying old messages. And it's kind of like all connected together. And that's why if you use the Svix libraries, for example, the Svix libraries automatically do it for you when you consume webhooks sent from a Svix customer. But if not, just make sure to check for those kind of things. And yeah, I mean, like again, like be nice. So if the signature failed, for example, return like a 400 error, or like with a message of like why it failed. If it's a timestamp, again, a different message, 400. Just like make sure that you return the right kind of errors. watch out for redirects. Redirects, first of all, are a security hole, potentially, but also just like you don't want to like overload the sender or yourself. So just like make sure that you put the right URL there. That's kind of like the very like high level, let's, like webhook consuming 101, like what you want to do to receive. I have like more advanced stuff in a moment, but how does that sound, Ken? Is that something that, do you have any questions on this?
Yeah, so I mean, it just in my head when I think about it too, it's like the absolute like basic table stakes is like the verifying the signatures and then making sure that you're sending the right response codes, essentially.
Yeah.
Well, and then I guess making sure that the vendor is actually like, sending you retries if it does fail.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, just making sure that the vendor is, up to task, right? That they can like provide a service that you want them to provide. And maybe sometimes, maybe if it's like, I don't know, it's like a crypto or like a stock ticker, maybe you're okay with missing some events, and maybe they don't need to do retries. And maybe, like there are like a lot of reasons why, maybe it's actually fine not having retries, so it's okay. Don't force them when it's not needed. But just kind of like better understand the use case of what they're sending and what you're receiving and how much you rely on them to make sure that there's alignment there and you can have the reliability that you want based on that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So someone, it's not like so mission critical, and probably you're going to get sent an update later again anyway, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. Like you're gonna like every update kind of like overwrites the previous one anyway, so you might as well like drop one. It's not the end of the world. Kind of thing. But again, in most cases, that's not the case. That's just worth mentioning, so you don't force your own views or my views even like on the wrong kind of people, on the wrong kind of provider. And then there's like, there are like other aspects of both etiquette and performance that are kind of like related. I'm going to do it. I think we talked about it the previous time as well. Kind of like you can do, like the bare minimum and then like slightly better and slightly better and slightly better. And so one thing that you want to respond to the webhook provider as quickly as possible. Why? Because they're gonna have timeouts on their end. At some point the webhook provider needs to kind of like give up.
Yeah.
I think our timeout is like 15 seconds. I think that's high, but maybe some people do more. But anyhow, it will. I very much doubt it will ever be more than 30 seconds.
Yeah, I think when I was doing some of these webhook reviews that we've been doing of different providers, it was anywhere between like 5 seconds up to, I think, I don't know if I've seen 30, but 20. It's like 5 to 20 was probably the general range of what I've been seeing for these timeouts.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, it's very high. Like it's very, very high. Like kind of like try to put yourself in like a shoes, but if you use an API, like you're never gonna wait 20 seconds. Like 20 seconds, like an obscene amount of time to wait. So it's kind of like webhooks. You kind of like you get more leeway, but it's not something. It just makes more room for errors. It's just not resource friendly. It's like bad for the consumer because you have like a lot of connections open. Bad for the sender because you have like a lot of workers going parallel. It's just not a fun experience. So if you can like respond quickly, that's best. And how can you respond quickly? So one way is kind of like receive it, validate it very quickly. So like validate the signature and all of that, and then add it to a background task locally. That can either be like literally in process, like kind of like write to a database or write to whatever to make sure it's persistent, and then like do it in process directly, or write it to a queue or to Kafka stream or whatever, and then do it in a separate worker. But the point is that just do the minimum check to just say, okay, this is a valid request, and then you can respond accordingly. Because if you have a bug in your code, realistically, you probably don't want to error and have the webhook provider retry. Kind of like want to handle it internally, and like not air your dirty laundry, as they say. So kind of like fix the bug, and just your own queue will just retry it. So that's a very common thing.
So kind of like separate the receiving from the logic of what to do with it.
Exactly. Yeah. And by that you insulate the bugs, but you also automatically get this like very quick response.
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the things I was wondering is like, how do these receivers handle receiving from different providers? Because again, with these reviews that we've been doing, I've been noticing a lot of people have very different policies and how they send stuff. So like, yeah, I just had no idea. Like, how do they actually go about like setting up their receiver? Like, do they have to have separate ones for each provider, or is it possible to kind of have one and figure out what's coming from where?
Yeah, so for whatever reason, as you mentioned yourself, like when you look at different webhook providers, all of them are done very differently, which is a bit annoying. But also, you're gonna have to like treat them differently anyway. So okay, let me take a step back maybe. So when all of the providers that use Svix, you can use the same libraries and same logic to like verify the request, like verify the webhook and do everything I would just describe. But you still want to know that actually this one came from Brex, this one came from Stripe, this one came from GitHub. You want to have this differentiation anyway. And so for that scenario, you're going to have different URLs for each provider. Usually, like convention that we use internally is kind of like /webhooks /provider name. But like do whatever. Some people like to have like randomized URL names. So kind of like for extra security, it's kind of like a pre-shared key. You can do everything you want. It doesn't really matter, because if you just verify the signature, that's usually fairly quick, and protects you against like people sending the wrong thing. But because like if you use, okay, actually another example. So if you use like Stripe and PayPal, and maybe they both have a concept of invoice paid, but actually an invoice paid from PayPal, an invoice paid from Stripe, like very different things. It's the same way that if you do like, you call an API and say like Stripe Pay and PayPal Pay, those would be like a very different operation. So I think like the webhooks need to be handled differently anyway. And it's just unfortunate that the signature verification needs to be so different. But other than that, like, it's going to be a different logic anyway. So I don't think it's the end of the world. And it's the same way when you get like different event types. So like an invoice paid is going to be different to a user created. You're going to have the logic to separate them. You might as well do it for like different providers as well, and have a clean separation.
Okay. And then, another thing that I thought we could go over a little bit was like when their endpoints fail, like what should they be doing?
Yeah, I mean, they should just like make, return an error and return the right error. So just like say, hey, it failed, and like explain in the content why. So they can as well in their logs later on, like when they go to, the webhook logging or webhook dashboard, what we call the app portal, they can just see the reason why it failed, and they kind of get like more information. But they can also have the logging locally, like they don't have to return it as the error message. One thing as well to remember about webhook receipts, like a lot of people have like monitoring to know when like some of their endpoints return a 5xx, so like an internal server error, but a lot of people don't have it for a 4xx. So and kind of like if you're like validating, you kind of like, you need to have monitoring in place to know that, okay, I'm returning a lot of errors to this like webhook endpoint, and I need to figure out why, or again, rely on your webhook provider to tell you that. But either way, it's kind of something that you need to be aware of and need to be like, because otherwise, how are you going to know that you're like failing all of those? So if, for example, you put the wrong signature key, verification key, and you're just like rejecting all of those, if you don't have internal logging for that, like you will not, it will be unfortunate to miss, I guess.
Okay. I guess this might be like an aside that I cut out, but because like in my notes I have like, okay, what about like testing? But when you're talking about logging, it in my head, for some reason, those two are linked together.
Yeah, so
I don't know if that makes any sense that they would be or not, but
yes and no. So like login would be more, like you would want it in production to kind of like understand what you want. You don't really use the login in testing unless like the test fail and you kind of like want to get more information. But in a way, like what you said, like you can look at like login as like testing in production, right? It's kind of like the tracing of what went wrong. But when it comes to testing, at the end of the day, it's just an HTTP call, and it's usually using a pre-shared key. And so that means that the same key that used to sign is the same key that is used to verify. So you can actually generate the exact same signature. You can write your own fake payloads when testing. So you can actually test the whole full circle. You can send your own webhooks. Another thing, which is a kind of thing like you talking about when testing, is testing locally. So kind of like you have an integration, you're working with Stripe or with a Svix customer or whatever, and you want to kind of like make sure like, hey, is my integration even working? And so one thing you can do, again, you can either fake the webhooks the way I mentioned, or you can just use a tool like what we call Svix Play. So if you go to svix.com/play, we have this webhook debugger that it also like does kind of like tunnels traffic towards your local machine. Or if you want a bit of a more, this is great for testing, but you have like a tool like ngrok, for example, which is like a more, I guess, robust. I don't know if I would call it robust, but like very like heavily used tool, and like it's the industry standard for like those kind of things. So you can use that as well to test locally. And kind of like tunnels, like it gives you a URL that you can put in your webhook provider, so you can get the webhook tunneled internally to your own testing.
Okay. Yeah, I still don't think I quite understand the ngrok thing. I mean, like I've seen it a lot, especially when you put local host into search queries that have webhooks, like webhooks local host, ngrok always pops out.
Yeah, it's a very popular tool. It's been around for years to do. Like they're super cool. They actually have like a Svix integration in the works as well. Like we're tightening. We like them. We really like them, and we think it's a great tool for like webhook testers.
Okay. I think the last thing, I mean, we touched on it a little bit, like in terms of like what the receivers should be looking for from their providers, but I think we touched it more on like they should
basic
definitely have the basics. Like, what about some of the things that like if I'm the receiver, like that I might not need, but like might make my life easier, like might help me.
Yeah, so it's kind of like, okay, there are a lot. I mean, we can just list them, and like I can go like a bit deeper on each of them. One thing to remember is like automatic retries, which we mentioned already. You just want something that will retry and make sure that you deliver. And kind of related to that, you want to get notification from the provider when the retries fail, right? Automatic retry is useless if they give up after 10 attempts and never let you know that they get given up. So you kind of like, you want to get an email, or you want to get like a notification in the dashboard or whatever. That's like very important. Another thing which is definitely not essential, but it really helps, is exponential backoff. Your service is down for whatever reason, or your service is overloaded, or your service, like there is a reason why you cannot receive a request. The naive implementation is just like to try every minute for like 24 hours or 72 hours. And that like a lot of requests. And as the more you fail, the more it's gonna like just like pile up. So like you started failing, and then like it's gonna try more minutes, and then like these are failing and they're still continuing. And you kind of like all of a sudden getting like to thousands of requests per second, which is just, first of all, it's like expensive, and I mean, not expensive in terms of like money, it's expensive in terms of resources to like handle. Your systems may not be able to handle that. So it's kind of like, it's good to have, like a system that like does it, with exponential backup. So kind of like increases the spacing as failing goes and grows. And it's kind of like this way you don't stack too many failures at once.
So just to make sure I'm understanding that correctly, what you're saying is, because new webhooks get sent out and they also then get retried.
Yeah, exactly.
Like as the longer everything is failing, you're just like piling more failed webhooks kind of on top of each other with the retries of previous failed webhooks.
Exactly. So let's say like you have the failures for an hour because like something was misconfigured. So you sent one webhook at the beginning of the hour. It's gonna try every minute for that whole hour, and then you send like 5 more webhooks a minute afterwards. They will try. So now you have like 6 webhooks every minute for that period of the hour. And then like you add more and more and more and more and more. At the end of the hour, you're already sending thousands of webhooks. For no good reason. And again, your systems may not be able to deal with that. So the exponential backoff kind of like says like, okay, I'm going to increase the spacing. It's obviously not working. Let's wait a bit longer. And kind of related to that is random jitter. So if you send, all of a sudden like a burst of 1,000 webhooks in 1 second, maybe your system cannot handle that. So it will time out all of them. So a naive implementation will just try all of those in 5 seconds again. And again, same problem. And then in 1 minute, same problem. And if you have like just random jitter and kind of like says, okay, I'm going to wait this one like 1 second longer, this one 2 seconds longer, it's going to like space them out evenly or randomly. So you can, you know, that you have like a better chance of actually surviving those, you know, like those loads.
The spikes, yeah.
Yeah, the spikes.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Yeah, for exponential measure, I always thought of it as like giving people time to fix their endpoint when it's failing. But it's also this idea of so that they don't pile on top of each other and like have this massive amount all at the same time. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah, it is indeed to give them time, but it's kind of like just saying, okay, I gave you time. It's obviously not enough. I'll wait longer. I don't need to pester you every two, you know, it's kind of like, yeah. I don't know. I don't have a good example in mind, but it's, yeah, you get it.
Yeah. No, I think that makes sense now. I just hadn't thought of it that way. So one thing I noticed looking at a few different webhook implementations is that it's pretty rare for people to offer manual retries. That's one of the things that we kind of value. Is that just because it's kind of like this premium feature where it's really nice to have, it's not critical, or like how do you think about the manual retry feature specifically?
Yeah, so let's separate manual retries to like two parts, right? One is manually retrying a specific message. So kind of like saying, I want that message to be sent again. And the reason why, I mean, I separating that because like this one is very useful for development. You kind of like, oh, wait, oh, I had a bug. Okay, let me deploy a new version to staging or maybe even locally. And then like, let's retry the message and kind of like see if it works. And for that is very useful and you want that for developers. And then the other one is kind of like a range. So it's kind of like saying, hey, you know, the retry policy takes like 3 days to exhaust. And actually I did a deploy on Thursday, didn't notice. It's on Monday. It was failing all along for all of this, or you know, for whatever reason. And you kind of want to just go back and say, well, replay all of the failing events from that period, which is also, I think, very rare. I think the reason why it's very rare, because in many cases, it's one of those things that you kind of like, I don't think we need to productize it. Come on, like, yeah, when it's going to happen, like they're just going to email us and then we're going to do it for them. And like, that's what a lot of our customers were doing before they switched to Svix. They were kind of like, whatever, you know, they let us know. And then you have annoyed developers running, you know, scripts or maybe predefined scripts in production to like redrive, rather than really just adding like this nice button that gives those customers like the ability to do it manually. And yeah, I mean, I think that like a lot of cases in general that like engineers prefer to just have like an ad hoc solution rather than a productized one because it's so much easier. But I think it's like a much better experience for your customers to like be able to redrive it immediately rather than like wait for support.
Yeah, they don't have to wait for someone to do it. And I mean, it's better for your team probably than to force your engineer, hey, like, can you go and send all these retries again for these people, please? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and then like, you know, like just a few other things that are, you know, are great for the provider. Sorry, for consuming. So you want to, I'm a big fan of having like nice SDKs, like nice lightweight SDKs, and like an SDK to do the verification, including timestamp, is like very helpful, and it's something that otherwise is very easy to get wrong. So that is definitely something you need to look at. You know, what else? There is, you know, documentation is always great. Kind of like knowing what kind of events to expect and what kind of payloads they might include. I think that's always like very important. Let me think. You know, another thing.
That is one thing that for me distinguishes a lot of the documentation that I've seen. Some people have like webhook documentation, but they kind of just talk about how it works. And they don't really give you an example of like, oh, here's the payload that you would get from this endpoint for this event type or this event type. And if you send it to this payload or this endpoint, you'll get this type of response. So some of them, like the ones, and obviously this is a correlation, the ones that have, you know, a lot of these advanced features also have very good documentation.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it's kind of always the case. You know, the developers can do everything, right? I mean, we can build. It's just a matter of time. You know, I think like if you look at the Windows kernel or the Linux kernel, it's like, I don't know, like probably thousands of years of human hours, kind of like So yeah, I mean, if you give like a sole developer, they can do it in a lifetime, maybe, not in a lifetime, in a few lifetimes. But it's kind of like, do you focus on that, or do you work on other business critical stuff? And I think the ones that you've described that are really good are the people that actually really rely heavily on the webhooks. And like Stripe would be a good example. You miss a webhook there, that is a terrible experience. You want a great webhook experience in Stripe. And then you have other ones that is kind of like, whatever, like we don't care. Our customers are not savvy enough to like realize that we're missing missing messages, even though they rely on that. So it's kind of like, I think it goes side to side.
That's interesting. I don't know how much like it goes both ways though. Like if you built the better webhook experience, would you not have then more usage?
Yeah, I mean,
customers.
I don't remember who told me that, but they did like a research and they saw that like webhooks, like good webhooks increase like I mean, they actually tied it to business goals. I don't know, like that's maybe again correlation, but they kind of like, okay, that increased like net dollar retention. I don't know, like, I mean, that's amazing. I don't know about that, but you can definitely see how great webhooks increase developer happiness and like the likelihood that developer, kind of like and your ability to rely on it, right? I mean, I think it was like even yesterday, or a few times in the last few months, like GitHub webhooks were down. That makes it very hard to rely on GitHub webhooks, and it's kind of like if people were using GitHub, in a, for something other than like GitHub is very sticky just because you already have all your code and all your processes there. But if it was easier to like leave GitHub, I think people, and webhooks were super important part of the process, people would. I mean, people are, but like for like different reasons, I think. Yeah. Yes, I mean, like one thing that's like very important is failure logs for debugging. As we described earlier, like when you reject for the signature or for the timestamp, you're gonna return a message that like says, like explains what went wrong. But also, also if it like goes wrong for a different reason, you kind of like want to know what went wrong and like what was the reason. And without that, maybe it was a DNS error, maybe your DNS was down. Like you don't always have the full visibility to know what went wrong. And having those failure logs is like very helpful in that regard. And then the last thing that I think is very important is supporting multiple endpoints. So what a lot of times what you do, you would want to like connect your system to like different systems, like your provider to different systems. So again, let's take Stripe as an example. So most of the messages you would want to send directly to your system to kind of like update, the accounting stuff. But maybe marketing wants to receive some messages through Zapier and send it to Slack, or update their Airtable, or like update CRM. But there are like a few of those kind of like connections. And if your provider only supports one endpoint, or so one URL to send webhooks to, you're kind of like very limited, and you have to implement everything I just mentioned in code. And kind of like have a lot of logic that like, okay, if this happens, dispatch there. If this happens, dispatch there, rather than the more natural way of kind of like, okay, just have the producer dispatch to the right places. Yeah, I mean, I think that's like a much nicer experience and like much more reliable. And I would definitely like look at that like the API providers. Yeah, and I think those are the main things I would look at.
One question now that you brought it up, I had on the logs, the debugging logs that you mentioned, like provided, that is like given to you by the providers. How would that be different from like the logging that we talked about, if like on your own end, if you're the receiver?
Yeah, so it's kind of like, when you think about it, you look at like, this is the message, it's being sent from the provider, this is you. Okay, so you can even like think about it like kind of like like a FedEx or Amazon or whatever package. So it's get delivered from the warehouse, and it goes on a plane, and then like it's kind of like driven to the center, and then it gets here, and then it gets to the door, and then they ring the door. And maybe you're not home, or maybe you are home, like, or your friend is home, and they open the door like, oh, I don't want to sign for it. So it's kind of like the moment they ring the doorbell, you kind of like maybe have awareness that like something is going on, and that's kind of like where the logging points in. So like the moment they reach your street and like knock on the door or ring the bell. But anywhere between, you have no idea. So maybe they came here, and here they lost a package, or maybe they came here, and here they they accidentally like wiped off the address or whatever, so they don't know where to find it anymore, or even your house burned down. So it's kind of like you're fumigating the house, so there's like no there's no way to access. So like what I'm trying to say, there are like a lot of places on the path from the provider to you where things can go wrong. And having that information here really helps like conclusively at least what they think went wrong. And you can be like, again, like a DNS error is a great example, or like a BGP disconnect, like kind of like the internet is like acting up and dropping packets. Like all of those things can just like go wrong. And and this is not theoretical. This is like stuff that we see live all the time. That's
it's like separate. It's like, well, you want both. You want you want the log from your provider for what they're seeing, and then you want to have a log on your end.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you don't have to have the log on your end if you're already sending back the information needed to the provider, and it's like part of like the response. But you definitely want it from the provider. That's what I'm saying. Like that's actually what gives you the full loop information.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Makes sense. All right. Well, Tom, thanks. I always learn a lot from these. Even things that I feel like, now I'm like pretty caught up and I understand like the exponential backoff thing, right? Like I hadn't thought of it that before. So it's always good to talk to you and get like your expertise on some of this stuff. So thanks.
No, thank you.